And there we go. It's working. All right. Hello, everybody. It's Uncle Grumpy. Welcome to Grumpy's Corner. Today we're here with Lawrence Pasternack. I'm not sure why that video isn't working on there. Let me see if it's working on here.
Somebody's joining.
Yeah. Hello, Leaf. How are you? Nathan, how are you? We got to see if our video is working here. Yep, it's working on the other end, so it's just not working on the laptop. Okay. Not sure what that's about, but okay. All right, folks. Lawrence had a meeting today with the OMMA, and we're going to talk about that. But before we talk about that, I want Lawrence to read something to us. Lawrence wrote an article recently for Extract Magazine, and I got to tell you, I find it to be by far the best explanation as to where we're at, not only as a community, but as a state and as a country with this cannabis movement and our fight to normalize this so that it's no longer we're no longer looked down upon. So, but he's worded it better than anybody I've heard so far. So I want Lawrence to take a few minutes and read that to us, and that way we'll all kind of understand at least how I feel where we're at before we even talk about what happened at the OMMA today. Lawrence, how you doing?
I'm all right. It was a very good meeting, which I guess we'll talk about in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And thank you for the interest in the Extract Magazine. This is contained inside the Oklahoma Gazette. I think this came out on Wednesday. That's right. Came out on Wednesday, and I think it'll be available until next Tuesday. I guess they come out weekly, every Wednesday. So if you want to read a copy, you can pick one up at a grocery store and so on. But you want me to read it out loud. So
yes, I do.
Bear with me, or bear with us. It's about 1,500 words, so it'll take us a couple minutes. I'll read it kind of fast, but hopefully not too fast. So everybody, here we go. They titled it Freedom Impaired. I had a different title, but this title's fine. Despite their defeat at the polls last June, the forces behind the 788 Is Not Medical campaign have used their positions of influence to help deny cannabis users full participation in society. Whether impaired or not, cannabis users cannot legally drive in virtue of our per se DUI laws. Employers can designate nearly any job as safety sensitive and purge cannabis users from their employ. Public housing authorities and their landlords almost uniformly deny benefits to cannabis users despite the discretion that the federal government gives to local authorities. Physicians, including most pain management doctors and oncologists, refuse cannabis users medical treatment, and the list goes on. Even though there are numerous studies that not only establish its medical benefits, but also link many autoimmune and neuropathic conditions to the endocannabinoid deficiencies, employers, physicians, schools, and a host of other entities in our state choose instead to regard cannabis use as a moral failing, or perhaps a sign of one's political leanings, rather than a treatment for physiological disorders. A treatment that was, long before cannabis was ever associated with race mixing in the 1930s or hippies in the 1960s, perfectly acceptable to the medical profession. For thousands of years, it was across much of the globe. It was used across much of the globe. And by the mid-19th century, it became a staple of medical care in the United States. But with the end of alcohol prohibition in 1933, Harry J. Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Prohibition had to find a new mission or be out of a job. He thus latched on to marijuana, persuading Congress to ban it under the pretext that it, quote, causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, end quote. Then, 30 years later, as the federal government was drafting the Controlled Substances Act and assembling its list of drugs that had, quote, no currently accepted medical use in the United States, end quote, cannabis was by then no longer being prescribed by physicians. Yet that was not due to a lack of efficacy or safety, but because of Anslinger's efforts a generation prior. In fact, just as the American Medical Association fervently opposed its ban in 1937, so likewise did the medical advisors for the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 recommend that it not be made Schedule 1. But in both cases, they were overruled by politicians. And so rather than medical science shaping public policy, the people of this nation became victims of a system of laws born out of wanton ignorance, bigotry, and hate. If not for the racism of Harry J. Anslinger and Richard Nixon's hatred of the political left, it is hard to imagine anything of this sort ever happening, but it did. Knowledge of its medical benefits was actively suppressed by the DEA, and the lives of tens of millions of Americans were destroyed by a government whose treatment of them hardly differed from the communists who sent counter-revolutionaries to gulags. For while we never went so far as to sentence cannabis users to death, we nevertheless annually arrested them by the millions and handed out extreme prison sentences in droves. All this because cannabis use came to be linked first with racial mixing and second with a youth movement that challenged establishment ideology. The danger, in other words, was not cannabis as such. It was that it came to be seen as an instrument of rebellion against the authority of the state, a choice on the part of citizens to control their own medical care and free themselves from the commodification of their bodies. Thankfully, this dark chapter of history is behind us, but while medical cannabis use will no longer deprive you of your liberty, its users continue to suffer discrimination. Employees fired, driver's licenses suspended, public benefits denied, probation revoked, custody denied, and medical care withheld. The rationales given for such sanctions are usually A, it is required by federal law, or B, cannabis use impairs cognitive performance. We may grant that both are sometimes true, but consider that standard workplace drug tests do not detect active impairment, but rather the non-psychoactive metabolite THC-COOH, which can remain in one's system for up to 90 days. Consider as well that in December 2018, the Controlled Substances Act was amended according to Section 12619 of the 2018 Farm Bill, removing hemp-derived THC from Schedule 1. In fact, studies indicate that the proper dosing of THC can improve cognitive performance for people with certain underlying conditions such as ADHD, as well as through improvements in sleep quality, pain, anxiety, and depression. Nevertheless, employers routinely terminate THC-positive employees or reject applicants on this basis, even if they only use federally legal products or use THC during their off hours. Moreover, because of the aforementioned change in the Controlled Substances Act, employers can now be fully compliant with the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act while allowing THC-positive employees to remain at their jobs. Likewise, any employer concerned about workplace safety, after-hours cannabis use not only does not jeopardize that safety, but might even enhance it, since many individuals use THC to improve their sleep quality, and fatigue is far and away the leading cause of workplace accidents. Granted, some employers may not know any of the above. They might assume that a positive test equates with impairment. They might not realize that federal law has recently changed. But it seems to me that many employers also do not want to reconsider their views. Industry coalitions and state chambers of commerce didn't merely call for the completely reasonable use of impairment tests for safety-sensitive jobs, but rather lobbied our lawmakers to let employers deny employment to anyone who tests positive for THC, regardless of whether the employee only uses products during their off hours, regardless of whether they are in no way impaired at work, and regardless of the recent changes to the Controlled Substances Act. For while most employers would have no trouble believing that their employees can drink on the weekend but come to work sober, or use Ambien for sleep but come to work completely alert, it seems that they do not care to believe the same about cannabis use. Perhaps their default view is that cannabis users are addicts, and so there is no reason to presume that their use is limited to outside of work. Perhaps they believe cannabis use equates with a moral failing. Perhaps they regard themselves as sentinels of a political ideology that still associates cannabis use with the counterculture of the 1960s or the race mixing targeted by Anslinger. For once, it is realized that standard workplace THC tests in no way correlate with impairment. Employment actions taken on the basis of these tests indicate that the employer simply finds any THC use whatsoever unacceptable. Hence, while the forces behind 788 is not medical can no longer send cannabis users to jail, they can at least keep them out of their places of employment, off their roads, out of their housing, out of their medical practices, and deny them the benefits under their control. No doubt there are some not so virtuous people who are also cannabis users, but the hallmark of bigotry is to believe in negative stereotypes rather than seeing members of a group as individuals. To be fair, some of those behind our new system of discrimination are not bigots. Some simply don't know the facts, and some wish they could grant cannabis users rights but worry about being ostracized by other members of their business community. After all, if one business views cannabis users as vile or untrustworthy, why would they want to do business with a company that has such individuals in their employ? This, sadly, is the social reinforcing dynamic of bigotry. For while many who want to oppose it feel that such efforts would come at too high a cost or that there is nothing they themselves can do to realize any change. The passage of State Question 788 is an important moment of progress, but as of today, cannabis use might result in the loss of your driver's license, your job, your housing, and your medical care. This is wrong. And this is also something that many patient licensees are not told and do not discover until it is too late. The forces behind 788 is not medical might have lost the vote, but have nevertheless succeeded in sending the message that anyone who gets a medical license shall pay a heavy price. So while other states and countries are moving past cannabis bigotry and have implemented laws that prohibit employers from taking adverse employment action solely on the basis of a THC test, we need our legislature in the next session to recognize what has happened since the passage of State Question 788 and stand against wanton ignorance, bigotry, and hate.
Very nice. Very nice. That is, thank you. Okay. Thank you for reading that. Thank you for writing that. I really mean that. That is, in my opinion, the best way you could put it. I wish I could just send a copy of this to every lawmaker and every person in a position of power and get them to just sit down and listen to that for a few minutes. And I want to say, some people asked at the beginning of the video, please explain full access 2020 to some new activists. Well, I can say that explains why we need full access 2020, because what full access 2020 is to me is pushing forward with a new petition to fix some of what the lawmakers have done to reinforce what you've just written about. It's not just about making it legal for everyone over 21 to purchase cannabis, but my goal anyway is an attempt to try and repair some of what's been allowed here. What I think has happened has been a big bait and switch. You've done an incredible job of wording, of putting into words exactly how why I feel the way I feel, and why I feel like we need to just keep pushing forward.
One way to think about it is that the establishment does not see cannabis use as acceptable, as socially acceptable, as morally acceptable. And they want to make sure that everybody knows that. And so the list of things that are denied cannabis patients is basically a way of saying that you got a choice to make. If you want to use cannabis, okay, you're not going to go to jail anymore, but you're also not going to have all the benefits, all the rights, all the privileges that everybody else in society has. You're a second-class citizen. And unfortunately, you know, the lawmakers, when they in 2612 introduced the provisions regarding safety-sensitive jobs, it's completely and absolutely reasonable for an employer to be concerned with workplace impairment. But the problem is the way that was written and the way in which it's implemented bears no correlation to workplace impairment.
Right.
The assumption basically is that if you test positive for THC, then you can't be trusted. Because again, the idea is that if you're a THC user, you're a bad person. You're an addict. You're not doing something that they feel that they would be comfortable having one of their employees do. Why? Why? They're comfortable with employees drinking beers, drinking vodka or whatever on the weekends. They're comfortable with employees taking prescription medicines. They're comfortable with employees taking, I tell you, Unisom, the over-the-counter sleep aid. I've used this over-the-counter sleep aid, and I can't believe how impairing it is. Even the next day, if I use Unisom, I don't feel safe to drive. So there's all of these things out there that are absolutely potential causes for workplace impairment that aren't a problem. But even if you use cannabis 90 days ago, that's enough to get you terminated.
Well,
that's just unreasonable.
Yeah, well, that's like I say, this is why I feel like we have to just keep pushing forward, pushing the envelope with cannabis rules, with cannabis petitions, whatever it takes so that we can overwhelm them with, I guess, evidence and laws that stop this from happening. So in combination, evidence as well as laws that stop this from happening. Now, I asked you to read this, and I wanted to go over this first because, as I said, this sets up how I feel about where we're at, and obviously how you feel, since you're the one who crafted this. I didn't have anything to do with this. So that leads into your meeting at the OMMA. Mm. So with this on your mind, how did you feel overall? And then we'll get into the details about the OMMA. Did you feel like you ran into these people that you write about in here, the no people, when you were at this meeting, or was it a mixed bag or what? And then we'll get into the details.
Overall, I felt very, very positive. I've had other meetings with the OMMA. I've worked with people within the OMMA. And, way back, July 2016, July 2018, I had my first meeting with Tom Bates, Buffy Heater, and so on. And I had a very good experience, and I was hopeful. But obviously, what we saw subsequent to that was very disappointing to a lot of us in the state. And speaking sort of in connection with this article, I think that there's been a legacy of seeing cannabis as somehow an enemy to the establishment, that there's this adversarial relationship between the government and cannabis. There isn't an adversarial relationship between the government and Unisom, right? But there is cannabis. And it's really just due to historical accidents, right? Just accidents. It was a completely routine thing for doctors to prescribe in the 19th century, and then it became stigmatized by this propaganda campaign. And then once it was no longer allowed in virtue of that propaganda campaign, a generation later, when hippies started to use it, it became seen as something that was counterculture, and again, thought of as unacceptable to social norms. But it's not the plant. It just happens to be these accidents of history of certain people who used it and certain people who looked upon its use. So we're now at a point where 50 countries around the world have legalized cannabis medicine. A couple countries have legalized recreational cannabis. 33 states, 250 million Americans more or less live within jurisdictions where at least medical is legal. So we're in this process of change. And then the question is whether or not the establishment in Oklahoma are going to be continuing to maintain the ideology from the 1930s to the 1960s. Decades-old perspectives born out of racism, born out of political ideology, or whether they're going to move forward and just recognize this as a medically beneficial plant that is eminently safer than a lot of prescription medications. So if you are working for the government and your job is public health and public safety, and you're looking at what you can do to help maintain safety in society, and you can steer people away, for instance, from opioid use and replace that with cannabis use and pain management, you'd think that would be part of your obligations within your profession. And none of that seems to have happened with this with the administration up till now, and hopefully with these new people it will.
So to pin you down, I know you felt optimistic. Okay, so let's get a little more into the detail then. Did you discuss any details that you were able to get them to do any more than possibly acknowledge? And was it Kirkpatrick that acknowledged them? We both met him now.
Yeah.
I was in a meeting with him on the 1st. Very nice guy, as you said. Younger person than we would think, but very hip to, I mean, he used some language that, clearly made it clear to me he was more hip than I was. So, and seemed to be positive about the ideas we had, but the lawyers seem to be the ones where all the devastation in the program is coming from. Right. And I didn't see any bend there at all. In fact, when it was slightly challenged, when a conversation with the lawyers in the meeting I was in was brought up, and there was just a slight challenge as to a contradiction they have in the regulation, their response was to say, go solve it in the legislator, when in fact, unless I'm mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, part of their job description would be to find harmony in the regulations when writing, or harmony in the law when finding or when writing regulations. So, but yet they've, as you know, written contradictory regulations. So how did you overall feel about, was there any bend at all?
Well, let's put it this way. Lawyers can be trained in terms of developing an adversarial relationship. The defense versus the prosecution, or in business negotiations, the attorney for one business versus another. And then you ask, what is the stance of an attorney that works for a state government, for a department within the government? That they may have adversarial relationships if, for instance, the government is being sued. But if you, for instance, are the attorney for a business and you're asked by the manager, by the owner of the business, to come up with some policies, make sure that they're consistent, right, that they follow the law, you're not going to create policies that are internally inconsistent. Your job for that business as their attorney is to come up with policies that reflect the law, that are internally consistent. And you would think then that the attorneys for the OMMA, their job should be, again, to have regulations that are consistent with the law and that are internally consistent. You'd think that should be obvious.
So you just reinforced what I've said. So how did you feel? Was there any give? Explain how you felt about Patrick, and then how you felt about any other.
I didn't speak with the attorneys that you met with, so I didn't have a chance to gauge them at all. But those who I did meet with today, all I felt were in that position where they were seeing basically there being a need to overcome that adversarial attitude, that the OMMA does not exist to frustrate the program. The OMMA, like if we go back to the beginning of July in 2018, when pretty much the first action was to start banning things that lawfully they couldn't ban, banning the flower and so on. So immediately they basically introduced their role as one of an adversary to the 57% of the state who voted in favor of it, as an adversary to businesses, as an adversary to patients, that they wanted to basically override the law and go their own direction. And regulations that are the regulations that came out November 1st, that were written by the administration before this, before Cox.
The administration, you mean at the head of the health department and the OMMA.
Right.
So everybody understands we're not talking about the previous governor or anything.
Right. That are filled with extreme problems that would cause, major difficulties within the industry. And so why did that happen? A lack of information, or did it happen because of an intent to basically set up, poison pills? I don't know. But let me give you an example. The November 1st rules requires that samples are 1% of the total harvest or the total batch for processors, 0.5%, and then a backup of another 0.5%, 1%. So, if you have a large outdoor grow and it's a 100-pound harvest, you have to hold back an entire pound for testing. That's completely unreasonable. And before I even got the words out as to what I wanted to say, what a reasonable amount would be, Kirkpatrick said 9 grams.
He just looked up what they're taking in Colorado.
That's exactly what I would. That was exactly what I was about to say. Right? Colorado only needs 9 grams, and what we're looking at here is a pound. In many instances,
454 grams out of 1,000 pounds, or out of 100 pounds.
Right. 50 times more. So he completely understood that made no sense. And likewise, overall, my sense was that he had an understanding of the science. He understood that, for instance, the workplace THC tests don't at all correlate with impairment. They're just testing for a metabolite that stays in your system for weeks or months. And he really came across as somebody who didn't see cannabis as somehow a social stigma, as something that only bad people do. He understood it as, basically a medicinal plant that has a long, legitimate history of use that got interrupted because of some political agendas. That is my sense of where he stood on the issue. So that's great. And then the question is the extent to which that attitude that he has, the leadership that comes from him with that attitude and with that understanding will carry over to give direction to the attorneys. Because if you did feel that those attorneys were more adversarial, still, as the director of the OMMA, he's the one that tells these attorneys what their mandate's supposed to be.
But, okay, and just to throw this out there, I understand, I would think that would be their mandate, but do they actually work for him? Maybe somebody else is setting their mandate and telling him what he can work within. Maybe they're setting his boundaries, right, as lawyers are supposed to do. Yeah. And maybe somebody else is setting their agenda.
Right.
Well, that's my concern because we've got a new head of the health department. Seems like a great guy, Mr. Cox. Yeah. And now this Kirkpatrick, another great guy. Seems like if he would have set this thing up from the beginning, we probably would be in a much better position right now. But we have the same lawyers.
Well, some of the same lawyers.
Okay, so we have less. So some of the lawyers that were at the table aren't at the table now. But all the lawyers that are there have been there the whole time.
Right.
But there's no new blood there is what I'm saying that I've noticed. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some new blood I'm not noticing. But like everybody I've seen so far, I've seen before.
So, let me give you an example. So I'm the director of religious studies at OSU, and so I have various faculty that work under me. And one of them told me about a way in which he communicates a certain issue to his students that I didn't think was effective, and I suggested an alternative. And so while, I'm not there to monitor to make sure he does it, that I'm giving him guidance as, in a certain sense, an employee of mine as to how to do his job, right? So there's a hierarchy, and people above, give guidance to people below so as to facilitate the common aims, right, of the department. And so that's presumably Cox and Kilpatrick, what they could do then to their attorneys, saying, this is the mandate that we as the health department and we as the OMMA have, and you are our employees, and this is what we expect of you. So it shouldn't be up to the attorneys to be adversarial when their bosses are telling them not to be.
Right, I understand that. And that's exactly how it should be. Yeah. The way you've said it is exactly how it should be. My concern, I guess I'm playing the devil's advocate here, and I guess there's no real answer to it, but just to throw this out there, since they are holdouts as far as I can tell, perhaps it's not working that way. Perhaps the tail is wagging the dog.
I don't know.
Because somebody else is in control or setting the agenda. And that worries me. That worries me because so many. Now, if I'm wrong, that will become obvious pretty quick. because we all know this most recent batch of rules they've rolled out isn't workable. No one is in compliant right now. 0 people are in compliant. Right off the top, we don't have any compliant labs, so we don't have anything compliant beyond that. So if I'm wrong, which I hope I am, then perhaps they find a way to, without the need of an injunction, they find a way to freeze these regulations until people can be compliant. And they can't be compliant until a little more is laid out.
So, you know, we're kind of waiting to see whether or not these hopes that we have get realized or dashed.
Right.
And when it comes to your feeling about some of these attorneys, then, you know, there's an office culture. There's a legacy of attitudes, because it's not as if everybody who was in the Department of Health is now gone. Positions have been reshuffled, but some people who played a role in that adversarial relationship still have, you know, other positions within the health department.
Yeah, you saw some of them today.
Right. So, you know, I don't know. I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. If you work in an office environment, there's cliques and subcultures, there's office dynamics, there's legacy alliances. So even if you bring in a new person, there's a legacy alliance that you have to the previous person that you worked under. These things are complicated. And I think that, in my opinion, somebody who manages people well, I even hate to use the term because I just don't even like to think about managing people, but it's a conventional term we use, is that rather than doing so with pressure and threat, that if you do so in such a way that you have a vision that you feel that will make the world a better place, and you hope other people will see it that way as well. I kind of think that that's the way for people to work together in, you know, any environment. And so if other people don't feel the way you feel, if you have, for instance, an attorney who just thinks that cannabis is evil and he hates the fact that he has to do anything to further the use of cannabis, he simply should opt out, right? He's no longer representing the vision for, hopefully, the new vision for the OMMA. So, you know, it's their house. They got to figure this stuff out.
Is it their house?
Yeah,
I thought we were.
They're not elected officials.
Well, that's true.
Right?
Okay,
right.
But they all work for the state, so
right.
I think it's all our house.
Sort of.
Okay,
you know,
you're right. They're not elected.
Yeah.
They're not elected. I get that.
There's an expectation, and if we want there to be change within the Department of Health, how does that happen? Right, by letting those who are elected know that we're not happy, and then they could have an influence because the commissioner is working at the pleasure of the governor, for instance. Yeah. So if we feel like the new OMMA isn't fulfilling the aspirations that we have for it, then the recourse that we have, other than simply direct communication, because maybe they just don't know what the issues are, they need to get feedback from us, is to let our legislators and let the governor know that we're just continuing on if this happens. We're just continuing on with unnecessary adversarial relationships, which again, you know, just as I wrote about, I think fall within the spectrum of bigotry, because there's nothing about the plant that should say you're a bad person for using it.
Right.
It's just simply, it got associated with things that people found morally unacceptable. You know, their racist attitudes from the 1930s.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So beyond that, let's talk just shortly about this new petition idea. I've not wavered from this in one bit. My plan has always been what it still is. Maybe it alters a little here shortly, I'm not sure. But what you've written about, in my opinion, in big picture here, we'll talk big picture, is why I think another petition is necessary right away. Because our government has shown, between the regulators and the lawmakers, they have managed to manipulate a situation to where both of them can point their finger at the other one. A simple case is the pre-roll situation. The most easiest thing to fix is the pre-roll situation. And the lawmakers keep telling me how they've reached out and thought this problem was solved. The OMMA keeps saying you need to take it back to the lawmakers and get it fixed. They want legislation to say that a dispensary can pack their shake into a paper before they sell it.
Yeah.
It's just it's beyond necessary. So because of this is why I'm a constitutional amendment that takes away all of this power for them to do this. I understand they'll still have some regulating power, but we can set the tone in the petition to as you keep saying, as the leaders of the office, okay, we can set the tone in directing them on how we want this to work. What do you think?
Well, of course, it depends on the content of the petition, how it's crafted, but there's a lot of things that we all believe need to be fixed. And I would hope the legislature is willing to do it. And if they're not, we're lucky to be in a state that does give us a citizen petition as a recourse. So it seems reasonable to me to have a alternative to our legislators if our legislators aren't listening. And let me just give you one concrete example: the safety sensitive job issue.
That's where I was headed next.
It's, again, completely and utterly and 100% reasonable for an employer to be concerned about workplace impairment. But what are the causes of employer impairment? The most common cause of workplace accidents is fatigue. Do they do anything to assess fatigue? No. Right? Generally, no. Certain exceptions, sure. But generally, no. But they do urine test you for something that you might have done 90 days ago. Right? Completely unreasonable. And our legislature handed that over to them. 788 protected people because these drug tests don't test for impairment. And our legislators tore that up. And what they did was they basically legislated based upon bad science. That I just kind of think that if something is bad science, there's no way it ever should become law.
Okay, well, we were both in the somebody called it wasn't me, so I don't want to steal this. Somebody else called it Weed Wednesdays. I call it the weekly circus, the Wednesday joint sessions. When the lady, I don't remember her name, but the lady from the Chamber of Commerce spoke, and she said her words were, they feel like anybody who ever tests positive for THC in a urine test is impaired, and therefore they deserved, as employers, to have the right to fire them for that.
Right.
They got exactly what they asked for. Right. John Eccles, our floor leader, has been on the show after that was rolled out and said, yeah, they got pretty much what they wanted. In fact, if you look at what she said versus the language, it's almost identical.
Scientifically flawed and bigoted. That's what that is. Because that what it says basically is that if you have ever used cannabis whatsoever, you're no longer a person we could trust. The implication is that cannabis use is correlated with a moral weakness.
Well, you've written about it there. She's proven it with the safety sensitive jobs part. Okay. So, and here's the thing, I'm hearing about little things being fixed here and little things being fixed there. I'm not hearing any, and a little tweak of the safety sensitive jobs isn't going to do it. A little tweak. And that's what I think we're going to be offered, is some minor tweak that might, that is going to imply that it will change the game, yet the process will still keep happening. The bigotry will keep on happening because it won't do it properly. This is why I think we need to eliminate the testing for THC at the workplace, pre or current employment, just like Arizona's recently done. And I think somebody else did it up in the Northeast also.
I read somewhere that 11 states have. Now, I don't know the details. I don't know whether those 11 states include safety sensitive exceptions or not. I don't know for sure.
They all have safety sensitive exceptions.
Right.
The ones I looked up one, and the story referred to, it was a story about it, so it wasn't the law itself. The story referred to how others were doing the same thing.
But then that's where we are too.
But their limit on what safety sensitive was considerably more stringent. Ours is left up to the employer.
Right.
So, I mean, I've got a guy messaged me last night who got fired from the kitchen he worked in.
Yeah.
And then somebody else matched that with getting fired from the warehouse job.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I've seen an abundance of those. And there's some federal language that provides guidance as to what a safety sensitive job is. And so our employer, or at least our legislators, never paid attention to any of that, right? And so one of the things you can do is more carefully define what a safety sensitive job is. And again, there's federal language that could provide guidance in that direction. But still, the broader issue is that, if you are a surgeon, if you handle nuclear material, whatever it is, why should you not be allowed to use cannabis during your vacation? Why should you not be able to use something that by the time you get to work, there is no impairment whatsoever? To think that you can't is unscientific. It's like, does it alter the brain forever such that if you got high once, you'll never be able to?
Yes, that's what they think, because
right.
It changes your way of thinking. Suddenly you're one of those hippies.
Exactly, that's right. So it's based upon this weird bias of the past, again, for which there isn't a scientific basis. Right? So why should we legislate? Why should we create these laws that are based upon flawed science? If you can show me that one use of cannabis causes somebody to no longer to be able to perform as well, let's say as a surgeon, or if you can show me that even 48 or 72 hours, never mind 2 weeks after you use cannabis, you can no longer perform as well as a surgeon. Okay, now you might have something, right, as a basis for law. But as it is, so far as I can tell, there is no evidence to that effect. There's evidence that shows that after X duration, you could function just as well. Canada, for instance, in Canada, the law is for military and for police, depending on your the particulars, it's either 8 hours or 24 hours. You have to not use for either 8 hours or your 24 hours before your shift.
So why don't we put that in to repair some of the safety sensitive stuff?
I think that's one way of doing it.
That's a good idea.
Right. And I think that employers have so many better options. Like, that's the thing. It's not taking away the only thing they have.
Well, because it doesn't have anything to do with impairment.
Right.
So
that's right.
You give them 100 better options, right, but they're still going to be bigots. So what's it matter?
That's
the options to them.
If you basically make it unlawful for them to take employment action based upon your THC analysis. If you make it illegal for them to take action, then basically that's a kind of pressure upon them to find a better solution. And there are better solutions out there that can evaluate active impairment.
And let's see, wait. 788 did that.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Right. That's right.
We already voted for something that did that. We already said we wanted it that way.
And they took it away.
Because we did
That's right.
State statute instead of constitutional amendment.
Right.
Again, this is why Full Access 2020.
And they took it away. And despite the fact that I had conversations with the legislators in the working group and with that woman from the State Chamber of Commerce too, right, about the fact that people are misunderstanding the science, right? That these tests don't do what you think they're doing. And so if you understood that and you still wanted it in law, why? It's like, oh, I don't care about science. People are afraid and we're just trying to give them something to allay their fear. But what are the social consequences? The social consequences is a vast amount of injustice to all those people who are terminated.
So that's it, okay? So because that's what we're going to get thrown back at us for using the word bigot, okay? And I understand some people find that inflammatory. Yeah, that's the intent.
Let's not diminish it. It is bigotry.
It is, even though it's based out of fear. Okay.
Well, that's what bigotry usually is based out of, right?
Right. So that doesn't make it right. It doesn't.
We are afraid of them. They're not like us, and we're afraid of them. So we want to make sure that they don't have anything to do with us, right? And that's where we are basically with 788, right? That one way or another, all these barriers have been put up. If you are a cannabis patient, you're not afforded the same benefits as anybody else in society.
I want to say how much I love cannabis, that it would put me at the table with the philosopher to have these conversations. I mean, that's what it's all about. So I had to point that out. It makes me giggle.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it?
It is. It is very interesting.
Part of what this says is that there's people across all spectrums of society that realize that cannabis prohibition is idiotic, and that the war on drugs is, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people share this, probably the worst public policy ever in the United States since slavery.
I couldn't think of a better way to put it. That's about it. Okay. Well, what's next? Anything else you want to talk about today? I think we just about covered everything.
Yeah.
We've been going on quite a while. This one's gonna get some people riled up, I have no doubt. Hello, everybody. How's your day going? Got any questions? Let's see. A lot of statements. I see that. Yeah, patients are still being discriminated against. That's what this is all about.
So let me say something, because I see a number of people talking about pain management, and this is something that, you know, I am very concerned about, and I've worked with the Pain Society, and we have had conference calls with physicians in other states. We have worked out clinical protocols for people who use opioids, who want to use cannabis as well. I've written language in 2612 that the doctors wanted. You know, I work with them on a policy statement for the Oklahoma Pain Society with regards to cannabis. Over the last year and a half, all these things have been done, and yet pain doctors, many, not all, but the majority of pain doctors still won't allow it. Cannabis is a respiratory stimulant. THC is a respiratory stimulant. It will make the use of opioids safer. You know, you'll either use less opioids because the cannabis will be helping you with your pain, or even if you stay with the same opioids, because cannabis is a respiratory stimulant, the main danger of opioids is the overdose due to respiratory depression. It reduces the risk of death, and a doctor won't let you reduce your risk of death.
Do you think it might have something to do more with, because you and I personally argue about this frequently, and we have today because, you know, we're talking new petition now, and we're working out the details and all that. And I feel like we've given the doctors enough, and it's down to they're doing this because they are bigots, because they've got issues. I'm being told from lawyers they're doing it because they want out of the opioid business, and cannabis is merely the excuse. You're coming at me on a regular basis saying if we just put one more thing in there to cover the doctor's butt, that suddenly they're all going to flip and start being okay with this. And I don't think that that's even remotely possible.
Maybe not all, but once again, in discussions that I've had with with doctors, I listen to what their worries are. And their worries are, they're afraid that the DEA is going to take away their license. Well, that hasn't happened for 20-something years, ever since California legalized. It just doesn't happen, right? And, you know, there's when the DEA made gestures in that direction, there was a lawsuit against them, went to the Ninth Circuit, and the physicians won. You know, they won't lose their license, but the doctors are afraid they're going to lose their license. So that's one. The next one is they're afraid of civil liability. If they prescribe something that is impairing and somebody's using cannabis and they get into an accident, the doctor's afraid they're going to get sued as well. And so, again, I don't see how that's likely or reasonable, but doctors are worried about that. And I think that there's some legislative language that could be used to allay that concern. And then, you know, doctors want to have control. They don't want you to use so much cannabis that you're impaired. But the thing is that that's sort of the only game in town, right? There's a recommendation, there's not a prescription, and doctors could lower your opioid doses. So one move that doctors could make is they let you use cannabis, you lower your opioid dose. And so they can reduce issues of impairment on one side of the picture. So there's all these things that could be done to address all the doctors' concerns. But so many of them are just not willing because of just this patina of fear.
Okay, so you listen to the doctors say that it's for fear of losing their license to the DEA, although that doesn't happen. Their fear of civil liability, although we can't find where that's happened, so that doesn't happen. So the fear of patients ODing, well, it's a stimulant, so that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Cannabis has killed 0 people ever.
Mm-hmm.
So what, in my opinion, what you've listened to is you've listened to their excuses, and you've given life to their excuses by saying to yourself, by convincing yourself and trying to convince me that if we just put in one more thing to cover the doctor's butt, they're going to change their mind, when all they laid out for you was excuses, because not one of those is a reasonable fear.
Right. They'll just have a new fear. So I agree. I think that if there was other language to protect doctors, that might get some, but not as many as we would still want. And I think then the big story is this, that pain management doctors feel like they have been stigmatized, right? That rather than being, a trustworthy, good doctor, they're now a drug dealer, right? So pain management doctors have this fear, this perspective that they're looked down upon. And there may be, there are other doctors who look down upon them. They feel that Mike Hunter's office is painted basically a target on their back. So there's all this fear. And then the thought that cannabis now gets into the mix, it's too much fear for them to manage. So it's not rational. And so long as cannabis remains stigmatized in this way, there are a lot of doctors who won't touch it. And it may not be that they're anti-cannabis. It may not be that they don't believe in the benefits of cannabis. It's just that they're shell-shocked from what's happened to them in their lives over the last 5 years, from being a completely respected doctor within a profession to being treated as a drug dealer.
Okay, so then can I get you to acknowledge this, that no language that we could come up with to put in any petition is going to do anything in a large enough scale until the federal government changes their direction?
Somewhere, I don't know. It'll be kind of partial, incremental. To some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. Other states aren't dealing with these issues, right? Pain management doctors in California, right, are prescribing to.
Okay, so
right.
wait, let me interrupt you, but let me ask you this then. So in the current situation we're in now, the things that you're looking for is ways for them to do things like we want patients to be able to sue for denial of care at some point. So, but can't they do that now? Like, for example, my doctor dropped me after 15 years of writing opioid prescriptions, tried to drop me with 30 days. When I threatened him with publicity, I was given 60 days. But yet the standard is, and I've actually recently, since the opioid trial, done some research on this. Believe it or not, I actually do. They're videos though, and had it described that you should never drop more than
25% every 7 days or something like that.
No, they were saying like just like half a milligram per month or something. I mean, it was a very low amount. And when my doctor put me on these originally, I remember all the warnings he gave me. He did give me a lot of warnings, and he gave me a lot of promises, like, I'll never cut you off because we can't do that with this. It may take a year or two to get you off of these. I'll cut them off no more than one a month is what he told me at this time now, 16 years ago.
Yep.
So,
and now
could I not have sued for malpractice or for denial of care?
Medical abandonment
currently.
Right. And my understanding
then why do we need to write another rule to make it a second to just reaffirm that? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with you that another option is that if there were patients out there who did sue their physicians for medical abandonment, that could change things too.
Okay, so if we had some patients, and I know we do, the screen's going to fill up with them before the end of the day, I'm sure, just by suggesting this. If we have some patients that have been abandoned, willing to sue their doctors, but here's the issue. We need a lawyer willing to fight this, that isn't going to make a lot of money at it, if any. So
well, they might if they win the case, right?
Sure, right. But this isn't a normal case that's taken on contingency. Yeah. Right.
Because you don't have a history of precedence. You just don't.
We want to set precedent here.
Right. So, of course, that is the case, and I'm kind of surprised. Maybe there are cases that we're not aware of, but I'm surprised that we don't have people we know who are currently in suits with their doctor who have been terminated. It's surprising to me that patients haven't done this.
So then, even if we wrote another rule, even if we got another petition passed, even if we covered the doctor's butt one more time, only a couple change their mind until, again, somebody steps up and sues. We'd be exactly where we are right now with maybe 1 or 2 doctors that you personally convinced out of the 1,000 that are in Oklahoma doing this. Is it worth all that, or do we need to work on suing them under the laws we currently have?
Well, you know, if there is a way in which we can add legislation that helps some and doesn't hurt, why not? I'm not opposed to it, and I think maybe there's a shot. Like, part of the issue is, can I take the doctors on their word? If they say, here's my worry, and if you can take away this worry, then I'll be okay prescribing opioids to patients who have cannabis cards. And if I hear a doctor say that, which I have, if I could take them on their word, then I can go to legislator and say, look, you know, the pain doctors may be willing to, you know, change, you know, and start allowing their patients to use cannabis. Because after all, 57% of this state voted for medical marijuana amidst an opioid crisis. What percentage of that 57, right, did so specifically to protect people against opioids?
Okay, but you did that. Everything you just said. You listened to the doctors, you went to the legislators, they put something in there. All that took place.
It's whack-a-mole. Yeah.
All that took place.
And then new worries popped up.
And nothing that we write down until the federal government changes anything is going to change all their minds, other than precedent, which is going to be a lawsuit. And that can happen at the stage we're at right now. It doesn't require more laws.
Could be.
Okay. All right. See, this is what we do. Lawrence and I argue this sort of stuff out. This is what I love about our friendship. We get to do this sort of stuff. It's fun.
Yep.
So, all right. Anything else you want to cover while we're on here? We've been on here quite a while. So,
well,
is it only, no, that's got to be wrong. Yeah, we've been on here quite a while. Let's see.
Well, we can just let people go about the rest of their day. We can stop talking.
Boy, you're just so nonchalant about that. You have to do a much better spin at the ending than that. I can't even find the video now. Where'd it go?
Well, I think it's up there still.
Okay.
I can see it on my phone.
All right. Well, we are going to get out of here, folks. You've heard it. Please, here, I don't mean to reach across you there. Please get your copy of Extract, which is inside your copy of the Gazette, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, the Gazette is really about the only paper, and Matt Dinger, the one behind this, is really about the only one covering cannabis properly in Oklahoma, in my opinion, on a consistent basis. So thank you to Matt for doing that. Thank you for getting Lawrence involved in writing this. And Lawrence, again, thank you for writing this. You've put it better than I've ever heard it. I want everybody to get a copy of this. Study this. When people ask you why we're doing what we're doing, have some of this memorized. If you don't have all the answers as to why we're here, they're all inside here. There, see, we've been right in an hour. So
yep.
They're all inside Lawrence's article. So please read that article. Send it to your lawmaker. Go read it to them if you have to.
You don't want me to come in next time and read my paper on the miscarriage of all philosophical trials and theodicy from 1791.
I'm down for it. We'll make that more of an after dark episode for those insomniacs that just want to learn something just because. We could do that. We could do that. All right. All right. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys watching. Please share this everywhere. Lawrence, thanks for having that meeting at the OMMA today. Let's see where this goes. As for Full Access 2020, that is pushing forward as planned. My plans haven't changed any, so it's just getting the details worked out right now. All right, folks. That's it for now. Until next time, stay grumpy. We'll see you on the road.